no one should have to choose between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Purina is helping to create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters through the Purple Leash Project, so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for this day.
Hey, Immigrantly family, this is Saadia Khan. I have some great news for all of you. We recently launched our newsletter, which comes out 3 times a week. It's called Hyphenly, which is our no-fluff newsletter with hot takes, heartfelt stories, and all the feels of living in between cultures. Come for the nuance, stay for the vibes. You can find the link to subscribe in our show notes. Don't forget to subscribe. Welcome to the Immigrantly Hive. I'm Saadia Khan, an entrepreneur, cultural thinker, self-proclaimed intuitive human, and your host. Before I get into today's episode, I have a few housekeeping reminders. As some of you may know, we have this incredible channel on Apple Podcasts called Immigrantly Uninterrupted, where you can listen to all Immigrantly podcasts ad-free for just $3.99 a month. And beyond that, by clicking on that subscribe button, you are signaling to the world that for you, authentic, unapologetic, honest storytelling matters, and you will not settle for narrational contraption anymore. How wonderful is that? And guys, if you can't subscribe, at the very least, follow us on our socials. If you go to our Instagram at ImmigrantlyPods, you will find a lot of information in our bio. And you can follow my account at It's Saadia K, which is at ITSSAADIAK, where I share everything from my thoughts on F1 to hot takes to my favorite lipstick shades. So don't forget to subscribe, follow, and share our episodes. And now to today's episode. Now, today we are diving into a book with its authors, and hence I am leading with curiosity and a bit of skepticism, because parts of Somebody Should Do Something, that's the book, they make so much sense to me, but then other parts, frankly, I have a lot of questions. And to help me unpack all of that, I am joined by 2 brilliant minds. Alex Madva is the professor of philosophy at Cal Poly Pomona, director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy, and co-director of the Digital Humanities Consortium. He is also co-editor of An Introduction to Implicit Bias and the Movement for Black Lives. And Michael Brownstein, he is a professor and chair of philosophy at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and a faculty member at CUNY's Graduate Center. Both of them are so accomplished. As I was reading this book, I was underlining almost everything. I was like, oh my gosh, I have to ask them this and that. And together, they co-wrote Somebody Should Do Something, which is published by MIT Press. It's a book that really explores how, listen carefully, how individual choices and structural change can actually work together to create meaningful progress. Sounds simple, right? Not so much. Let's see what is missing from this conversation. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Welcome, Alex and Michael. So excited to have you on Immigrantly. How are you guys doing?
Doing pretty good. Thank you so much for having us. It's an honor to be here.
So, I will start with the title of the book. In my intro, I talk about the book, and these days I am sharing with listeners what I lead with before every interview. So, curiosity is one, but we'll start with the title. Somebody should do something. It sounds to me like a moral indictment of sorts, but it is in passive voice, right? The book urges people to focus on individual as well as structural actions. And yet your title says somebody should do something. Why not let's do something? We should do something. What was the thought process behind the title?
Well, there was a lot of thought processes, and part of it was the product of a long search of a title that would both speak to the content of the book, but also just grab people's attention. We definitely did not intend it to make anybody feel shamed or, like we were calling on them to feel badly for any choices they've made. I, I guess my view of it is that the book calls out to individuals because individuals are the people who read books, and we're all individuals on some level. And that connects up with the content of the book because it really is about the relationship between each of us as individuals and the institutions and the cultures and the social systems that we live within and that we create through our choices and hopefully change and recreate as we make new and better choices. The other thing I would add is that the book is not framed as an attempt to persuade anyone about a particular set of problems that they should care about. It's not grounded in how do I want to say it, a particular political program or a particular set of moral principles that we're trying to convince the reader to join up with. Rather, the idea is everybody has the things that they feel passionately about and the values that they have, and in particular, the problems that they see in the world and that they're concerned about. And many people feel powerless to change those problems and to do something about it. And so when we said somebody should do something, the implicit message is that we all feel that way sometimes. And of course, things change when each of us embraces the idea that we have some role to play in bringing about that change. It's really like a call to act on the concerns and the values we already have and a set of ideas about how to do that effectively.
Alex, do you want to add anything to this?
As Michael was saying, we've all had the experience of you're reading the news and something terrible is happening, and you might turn to the person next to you and say somebody should do something. And we were trying to speak to people who were feeling that way, but ultimately the hope of the book is that somebody will be you, and in particular that it won't just be you on an island acting alone to save the world as a superhero, but that it will be you acting in concert with others. I'm sure we considered the possibility of let's do something as a book title, but it's already taken. So it was quite a long journey actually finding a title that 3 separate people with different preferences liked, and also one that wasn't already spoken for.
So let's talk about why you think people don't act in meaningful ways sometimes, despite good intentions. Your book talks about how interconnected we are. We are social animals. We like to be in groups. And yet, we don't act meaningfully for a number of reasons. What are some of the internal barriers you think stop people from doing something?
I think there's some degree to which all of us think of ourselves as individuals. We're all on some level existing within our own skulls, but that varies quite a lot across cultures. The reason for that, of course, is because as we grow up, we learn from our parents and our communities different ways of thinking of ourselves and understanding what we are and who we are. So the three of us are Americans, and we've written this book very much in the context of American culture and American politics. American culture is, if not the most, then very much one of the most individualistic cultures ever. And so I think the real significant barriers are the ones that are embedded in the particularly American and Western cultural history of individualism. So we tell the story in the beginning of the book of many different ways in which that culture of individualism was cultivated and grown, often for strategic purposes, oftentimes at the behest of people who wanted to maintain power and make money by using that message. So, for instance, the sort of opening scene in the book tells the story of how, at the very early days of automobiles taking off in the 1920s, there was a real concern about safety for people walking in the streets, because at that point kids would be running around in the streets and people would stop and chat in the middle of the street. In cities in particular, the streets were just a thoroughfare for life. And all of a sudden now you have cars driving fast down the road, and there is skyrocketing rates of pedestrian injuries and deaths. And what the car companies saw was the possibility that cities and states would impose laws to protect people. So for instance, in Cincinnati, there was a effort to force car companies to install a device which they called a governor, to make it so that cars could only go 25 miles an hour or less. The Automobile Association did a lot of work to prevent that policy from being enacted. And what they did instead was they did a public relations campaign to make individual people feel responsible for their own safety. And they invented a term which is still with us today, which is a jaywalker. So it was a portmanteau of being a jay, which was a country bumpkin. It was an insult. And then somebody who walks into the street like not paying attention. So the idea was like, let us, the car companies, keep making as many cars as possible, and let's get people to think of themselves as the ones who have to deal with this problem. That lesson gets repeated over and over again, from cigarette companies to fossil fuel companies and so on and so forth. This is a long-winded way of saying that people have had to be taught to think of themselves as individuals who bear the responsibility for solving whatever problems are on the horizon. And it's really infected the ways that people think about making change. And that's sort of where we jump in with our message in the book.
You're right. That's exactly how American society is structured, right? Individualistic versus collective. Individual well being supersedes collective well being. That is the whole premise. But in a society where everybody is looking after themselves, where everybody is so fixated on their freedoms, their rights, how they look at what they deserve versus what the community or the collective may need or require. How do you ensure that an individual will recalibrate their mind into thinking, oh, let me first think how my action will impact the structure or society or systems?
Excellent question. And ensuring that people make that switch is a tough ask, but we do try to offer concrete tools in the book for putting people on the right track. And one of them is probably a concept that's familiar for a lot of your audience, which is just the idea of a growth mindset, of being able to think that we can change. And that the relevance of a growth mindset comes up in a lot of different ways in this context. But as Michael was saying, we were taught to be individualistic, and that led us to forming a bunch of habits for thinking, my primary responsibility is to take care of myself. If there's a social problem, then my primary responsibility is to make sure that I'm in my own little bubble handling that well. So if I'm concerned about the climate, then we've been brainwashed into thinking the primary things you should do are just focus on your own consumption habits. If you're concerned about racism, the primary thing to do is just make sure that you're being respectful to the specific people that you interact with. And those are habits. Those are tendencies. And the good news in the book, and why this ties back to the idea of a growth mindset, is that they can be changed. So there's lots of evidence that there's a whole range of different skills we can cultivate to start shifting our orientation. For those of us who have been brainwashed into an individualistic mindset, we have further to grow than lots of other folks do, but it's nevertheless possible. And so, for example, one kind of individualistic tendency we have, there's some reason to think that this is a pretty deep psychological tendency, even in more collectivist contexts, but then it's exacerbated by growing up in an individualistic context, is if somebody does something wrong or if something strange happens, then we want to try to understand why that is. We leap to thinking, what is it about that specific individual that led them to do that? Maybe they don't care. Maybe they're lazy. What are their personality traits? What are their motivations? What are their beliefs? And we're like zeroed in on that particular individual. But the research is actually really clear that we can practice thinking about explaining what's going on in different ways. And we can start shifting our attention so that we're not just looking at that particular individual in the foreground of the picture, but that we're looking at the whole background around that individual and thinking about, okay, maybe the person didn't come late to work because they're lazy or they don't care. Maybe there was traffic. Maybe maybe they have family responsibilities. Maybe the power went out because they live in a neighborhood with inconsistent access to electricity. There's all sorts of different situational features that we can practice training our attention to. And then the next step is that it's not just about having a growth mindset about ourselves as individuals, that I myself can change, but also having a growth mindset about our institutions. So we have to believe that we can change institutions when they're broken. Although perhaps we should think about focusing on holding on to democratic institutions that are eroding. But the same basic logic applies, that we can't just look at the individual, we have to think about the system.
Alex, I really like the way you describe it, but the underlying assumption here is that individuals are compassionate and they believe in changing systems and they believe in universal humanity, right? But we do see a lot of narrational contraption happening in the US, right? The narratives around climate change, poverty, capitalism. Some people may not want these institutions changed because it serves them in the long term, whether they as individuals or their legacy, their race. So how do we convince those individuals who have really benefited from the disproportionality of these systems and institutions to partake in the change?
Yeah, this is a huge question. But I think the first thing to say is that, at least for now, we live more or less in a democracy, which means we don't have to persuade 100% of the people. We just have to persuade 51%. And we just have to build coalitions that are strong enough to win elections, and then coalitions that are strong enough to actually implement the kinds of policies that we want to see in the world and make sure they take root. So I don't think our orientation in the book is trying to persuade everybody to be on the same page about everything, but we're thinking one part of our audience are folks who are already motivated. Again, that's the title, Somebody Should Do Something, but feel at a loss about what to do. And when they become aware, oh, I was brainwashed into thinking about these things in individualistic ways. Now I see that there's a big structural system behind it, but what can I do to change the system? And trying to reorient people so that they're thinking about these things in different ways. And conversely, designing systems that help people to do that. So we are very much oriented towards persuasion, but it doesn't have to be 100%. We are also motivated by folks who have explored powerful pedagogical practices to, for example, motivate people to care more about racism. And there are a number of different effective strategies that people can use to get people on board, so that it's not just a matter of making sure that they have the right kind of beliefs, but that they also have internal motivation.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? easy with the new Galaxy Watch 8. Sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
So the question about voting, for instance, when I vote, I should not just think about how this vote will impact me as an individual, but I should also be very intentional about how it will impact my neighbors, my community, society in general. But what if what my neighbor wants is so morally and ethically different from what I want? How do I think about people who are morally and ethically at odds with me when I'm making those choices?
I mean, I'll say I think it's a really hard question, and I don't think there's any easy answer. It's fundamentally the question of liberal democracy in a multi ethnic world. And this is not really part of the book so much, but just my own take is that that is the question that has animated both the greatest moments of progress and the greatest moments of shamefulness in American history. And on my read, what we're seeing right now, where there is such a resurgence of hatefulness and a real feeling like the wheels are coming off in terms of our ability to live peacefully with one another and understand differences, and is that it's not new. It's the resurgence of this roller coaster that our culture here, at least in the United States, has been on for hundreds of years. And to me, it connects up with the point you made about how to think about voting in the following way. I think that we're in a moment right now where hate mongers and people who don't think brown people or people from other countries or women for that matter have like equal status in our country are feeling free to express those views in ways that they haven't for a long time now. And that's a change in the culture and the political norms that are around us right now. So we're in this really scary moment where those forces are more pervasive and ubiquitous, and they build upon themselves because the more you see it, the more it seems like the normal and the acceptable thing to do. And that's precisely the same power that we're appealing to when we say, when you vote, one thing you're doing is just, throwing your name in the hat, so to speak. But this other, almost more important thing you're doing is you're standing up for a set of values. You're embodying in your action the kind of community you want to be a part of. And that's the kind of community where everyone gets an equal voice, where people are due respect, and the opposite of all those forces of hatefulness that I was describing. And voting is just one of a million actions, I think, that we can take where the mental and emotional framework doesn't have to be, I'm just doing my little part, I'm just a drop in a bucket, but rather, I'm being the kind of member of a community that I value, that I want to support, and that I want to help change the norms of and represent those norms. And those are the norms that we see growing, at better periods in American history and that hopefully are in the near enough future.
I want to go back to what Alex said. Just to clarify, we are not targeting 100% of the US population, right? We are targeting 51%. You are aware of the limitations of who you can target and convert and convince, right? So just want to clarify that. And that makes a lot of sense to me because in my mind, as I was reading the book, I was like, okay, but how will this reconcile or square with XYZ, somebody who has such different moral values and ethical outlook than I do? But I do want to introduce another roadblock. Let's foreground the 51%. Let's focus on them. Let's center them, decenter the rest, whether it's protests, social movements, voting, whether it's working within your communities, something that we are seeing in the US unfold. When dissent is criminalized in closed systems, how do your models adapt or survive? And how do that 51% implement change when they are incarcerated for it?
I think that's absolutely a fair question. And I did want to spend some more time thinking through this particular set of issues. So, when we talk about people who are morally and ethically at odds with us, I have some of them in my own family. And to get back to what Michael was talking about, like part of living in a liberal democracy is learning how to live together. And even people who see the world really different from me, I have to learn how to live with them. And I think if you're chronically online, then you're often just seeing certain caricatures of the other side. But if you actually have people that you're close to that see the world differently, that can make it very salient to you that we live in polarized information environments. The information that people are getting about immigrants, for example, in some media bubbles is completely different from the ones that I'm getting. So I know that immigrants are actually less likely to commit crimes than people that native born to their particular country. But that's not something that is shared knowledge. But one of the fundamental things to do here is to talk to each other. And although I'm certainly not trying to be rosy about persuading everyone, but I think people could really be surprised about how much common ground there is about polarized topics. So, for example, a majority of Republican gun owners believe there should be more strict regulations against guns. So one example we talk about in the book is the power of the NRA to be a small group of committed individuals who change the world. They're a really striking example of the power to make a difference, although it's not a difference that we in particular support. But if I just have a stereotype of what Republicans are like or what gun owners are like, then that's a missed opportunity to actually find common ground with someone who sees the world differently from me. Another example we mention in the book is beliefs among Americans about whether we should be doing something to fight climate change. If you poll Americans, they'll say that they think a third of other Americans believe we should be doing more to address climate change. Actually, it's 2/3 of Americans who think we should be doing more to fight climate change. So this is the phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance, when we don't know what other people know or don't know, right? And so the way to overcome that is by talking to people. And again, there are potential opportunities for surprising coalitions that could organize around those themes. So if we're talking about, to get back to your question about dissent, if we're talking about a full-blown authoritarian regime, it's really, really hard because people are uncomfortable even saying what they think because the other person might be a spy who's going to report them. And that's a particular set of challenges. And that would be a very different book for thinking about how to tackle them. But I think if we're operating in a context where, let's say we have family obligations or work obligations or whatever it is, and we can't just like go ahead and protest and like get arrested. Certain celebrities who are happy to get handcuffed and then they, know that they're going to be let out later. Lots of people are today operating in much more dangerous circumstances. And we salute people who are willing to put everything on the line in support of their movements. And we profile a number of full-time revolutionaries in the book. But we think that we also discuss everyday things that people can do, paying attention to their social locations, what opportunities there are for them. And again, that I think for now, it's often safe at least to talk to people. And then we might discover that in some cases, not all, but in some cases, there's more common ground than we realize.
How do you start that conversation? Like, for instance, when I think of talking to people now, I am an immigrant, I have an accent, I am Muslim, I am a woman. I've lived in this country for over 20 years and I'm a naturalized citizen, yet people see me as an outsider because of the fact that I wasn't born here. Not just that, they see my kids as outsiders because of the way they look, although they were born here. If somebody is refusing to acknowledge my existence and normalize my identity, where do I start that conversation? It's not an ideological or a political disagreement. It's like, I don't see you and I don't want you in this country. So give me some pointers for how to start that conversation.
I would want the pointers from you who have a lifetime of experience in dealing with managing that exact challenge. Alex and I are very privileged, white American men who have not had the set of experiences you have.
Michael, unfortunately, I haven't overcome that roadblock. And I'm really curious to do what Alex said. I think it makes a lot of sense. Having those human connections, I created an organization meant to have those human connections, right? Show immigrants in through their humanity versus their politics or what's happening in the political realm. So it's extremely important for me to make those connections, but I haven't. I've, as some may say, lived in my own bubble, my own liberal, progressive bubble where I hang out with people who say the same things or say the right things by me.
Well, yeah, I mean, I live in Brooklyn, so I'm in a similar bubble. So it's not so much born of my personal experience, but I mean, I guess I can say two things, one very academic and then one that's just a personal experience. So the academic one is that, where I would go for the scholarly literature on this question is on the theory of what's called intergroup contact, which is sort of the longest standing idea coming out of social psychology of how people from different groups who identify differently can change their attitudes about each other. And the overly simple version of it is that they have to do things together, they have to interact. But of course, as your experiences attest, and many others do too, that's not enough. It's insufficient to just interact because all the stereotypes that you've imbibed from the culture can interfere with the ways that you see each other. So, some conditions that seem to make cross group interaction have the kind of outcomes that we would want, where people change their attitudes about each other, is that when people interact in some activity that they think is meaningful, that it's not just like some shallow exercise that the boss has told them to do. Another is that they are on relatively equal status in the interaction, right? So it doesn't work if one person is in charge or one group is in charge telling the other group to do the task or whatever it is. And the third is that the interaction be somewhat sustained over time. So it can't be so brief and superficial that, everyone just checks the box and then moves on. So that still leaves quite a lot of room for the imagination, for the kind of interactions that people can have. And I think there's all kinds of interesting experiments, from sports teams that integrate groups from different cultures and backgrounds, to even trivia games kinds of things. And I don't mean to, again, be like Pollyannish about it, but I think that sustained interaction doing something that's relatively meaningful on relatively equal status does have a pretty good evidence base for having the power to at least diminish people's fear and animosity about each other. The personal example I'll point to, and I have no evidence for what it does, but maybe you or your readers are familiar. But a couple years ago, I learned about this organization called, I think it was called the League of Kitchens, and basically the idea was it was mostly women, but I don't think it was exclusively women, but women who liked to cook and who were immigrants to the United States. And you and like five or so people could pay to go to their home, and they would cook a meal and teach you how to make the meal. And you'd spend the night together. And so I went to a woman's home from Bangladesh, and we spent the night learning how to make dough and cooking, and then we ate together. And it was clearly set up to sort of bring together foodies with people who wanted to have an experience and meet someone who they wouldn't have an opportunity to meet in another context. And I thought that was a great incarnation of the theory of intergroup contact that gives you all that sort of nice experience. I don't want to end on a down note, but of course, the open question for everything I said is how do you get people through the door, right? How do you get people to want to have these sorts of interactions? I mean, that's a hard question, but I think it's a real one to face up to.
I was going to follow up with that willingness to go and do that. And it may be different for you, but somebody who's hardcore, who believes all immigrants need to be deported, may not feel comfortable going to a Bangladeshi woman's house and spending time with her. I do like the idea of being on equal footing, having some sort of, not a shield, but a protection of sorts, where whether it's socioeconomic, unfortunately, or educational, where you don't feel like the power dynamic is too obvious.
This is a super important topic. And I also wanted to mention intergroup contact because I think one of the first things to note here is that one of the worst effects of the individualistic culture we've grown up with is victim blaming and thinking like it's solely your responsibility as an immigrant woman to cure everybody's racism. Actually, it's their responsibility to not be racist. It's our responsibility to be active bystanders. So when we're talking about the role of the individual, that's all of us, right? And so we certainly can't leave this conversation thinking it's your job to cure everybody's racism. But of course, we also don't want to give into the alternative where it's like there's nothing you can do and you're powerless. So I think one thing to say, if we're thinking about things like intergroup contact, we both want to be thinking about individuals changing systems, but we also want to think about systems empowering individuals. And so perhaps you can't persuade the parents of your children's friends, but your children's friends are in school too. And you yourself can look at how are those educational institutions designed? Are they designed in ways to promote intergroup contact or to harm it? And of course, there are forces that are trying to undermine intergroup contact at the system level and forces that are trying to promote it.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
When I think of impact, I think what I feel I haven't been able to do is communicate with people who think differently from me. And that is probably an intentional choice. And that's my way of guarding myself against any harm. Although I see myself as a privileged immigrant, whether it's my education or socioeconomic status, I come with a lot of privilege as well. And yet, I haven't been able to cross that inertia because I want to be protective of my mental health and well-being, my physical well-being. It's not that I don't think I've been able to make an impact. I just feel like I haven't crossed that boundary yet.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And, thank you for sharing about these experiences. So another area of research that's really relevant here is the research on confronting bias and discrimination. And it suggests that a lot of our prevalent beliefs about that are mistaken. For one thing, if you're chronically online, you'll just think that everybody's shouting at each other all the time. But what the research is really clear on is that this problem is the same problem it's always been, which is passive bystanding. Whether it's an explicitly racist comment or an implicitly racist comment, people go along to get along and don't engage. But there are further striking findings from that literature that I think are really relevant here. And they've demonstrated this in a number of studies, one of which is that in cases where someone is confronted about their bias, they're very likely to deny it. They're very likely to get angry. They're very likely to say, how dare you say that, xenophobia or racism had anything to do with that? I don't have a racist bone in my body. However, they are also likely to change their behavior. And so there's room to think about what is the most skillful way that I can finesse this conversation where I can get the person to change their behavior without, getting yelled at. It's really important to bear in mind that there's a distinction between the initial defensive reaction we get from someone and what they go on to do after the fact. one of the themes in the book is that we don't appreciate how much influence we have on each other. And we're largely focused on the influence we have on the people who are close to us, but it also applies to the influence we have on people who are not, central people in our lives. And so it's entirely possible that even in the moment, even if you just kind of furrowed your brow or didn't laugh at a joke, that was sending a signal like, hey, I don't think that's funny. I don't think that's okay. And that person might very well have gone on to change their behavior after the fact. But you only see the initial defensive reaction, so you don't know what's happening next.
That's a great point. And I never thought of it that way, because first interaction, whatever facial expressions, language you get, you basically base your assumptions or how people may see you on that. But I do want to go back to something else that we talked about, change, right? Norm shifting. That's the idea here, where we are saying that individuals and systems should come together to change systems, have this relational influence and structural change at the same time. If the norm shifting is happening too slowly, are there any moments or situations in which you think confrontational or disruptive tactics are morally and strategically required to make that change happen sooner?
I don't know if Alex and I have the same views on this because we haven't written about it or had to work it through. So I guess I would say I'm sure there are circumstances where extreme actions are justified. I think that oftentimes, this may not be what you mean, but oftentimes when people ask this question, lurking not far below the surface is really a question about violence and about whether violence is justified as a tactic.
Violence is relative, though. Like everybody's definition of violence is different.
Good, right. So maybe start on the kind of easiest case, because you said disruption, right? So if we imagine some of the tactics of the climate movement recently about, blocking streets and so on, I am pretty straightforwardly utilitarian or consequentialist about those situations, which just means that if they work, I'm all for them. And if they don't, then I don't want to embrace them. And my reading of the literature on civil resistance and civil action is that disruption can work when it puts your opponent in a bad position, where it forces the people in power or the people who you're trying to get to change under pressure to make a decision that they don't want to have to make. And so like if you imagine like in an American context, the canonical case of civil rights protesters putting police who they knew to be violent in a position where the police were either going to have to back down or they were going to beat them up. And either of those options were bad for the segregationists, right? So if you can leverage ordinary disruption in a way that puts pressure on people, fine, from my perspective. The moral questions really start to come in play when you're not just talking about making life inconvenient for people, but you're getting to something more like violence in the ordinary sense. So I'm not even talking about property destruction, but I'm, something like I just went and saw the new movie One Battle After Another. So I have in my mind like the image of, vigilante revolutionaries who are bombing buildings and even assassinating people and so on.
Hollywood does project that image. You see aliens coming in from another planet, and then we see vigilantes resisting them. And that resistance is violent. Sometimes social movements cannot survive without some degree of violence. And again, violence is relative in many instances. Something that seems violent to me may not seem violent to you. So why is that we always have to preface it with violence is bad? Do you think violence is always bad?
No, I don't think violence is always bad, although I'm hard-pressed to think of cases where I would want to defend violence in like an American contemporary political context. And again, I would go back to just almost leaving aside the moral considerations, which of course we could explore, but I don't think you need to go there because I think the evidence suggests that it's virtually always counterproductive. There's really great research, for instance, to go back to the civil rights movement, again, looking at the increase in vote share in specific areas where there were nonviolent compared to violent actions. You see much more vote share against segregationists and white supremacists in those areas where resistance and civil rights movements were nonviolent. That's just one data point, but there are lots of others.
Well, I think absolutely violence is sometimes required, but it certainly depends on the context. But the United States in the first century or so of its existence, and before it was constituted as the United States, was a slaveholding nation, and lots of persuasion and politics and protest didn't work, and we had to fight a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people to end a gross historical injustice. Are we in that kind of moment now? I'm also sensitive to Michael's concerns about consequences. And I'm just think about it in terms of like, I don't know, how many drones that can drop bombs do you have? Because I could try to be violent against an unjust system, but I think the technology and the power is such that that's not the most strategic way to leverage the power that we do have. And we need to exhaust other options first if we want to be effective. And I'm also mindful of the current polarized media environment where if you have 1 million protesters and 99.99% of them are nonviolent, but one of them is violent, and maybe that person was actually a plant, that one bad act is the only thing that half of the country or 40% of the country is going to see. And so I think we have to be strategic when we think about these things. And for people who are willing, whether through violence or nonviolence, to put everything on the line, I think they're absolutely admirable and praiseworthy. And there are absolutely historical moments of injustice that could not have been overcome without that. But I also think even during those moments, there were lots of other individuals with lots of other roles and obligations who were able to resist without putting everything on the line. And there's room to admire folks who are willing to go above and beyond and to recognize that some of that is needed. But to know, like, if I have an ailing parent, maybe I can't, put my life on the line, but there are ways to resist. And so I think resistance to injustice is required. What that's going to mean is going to vary for particular people in particular social locations.
I think the definition of violence really depends on who's committing it, right? When people in power or the oppressors do it, it's justified. But when the oppressed resist, it's criminalized. Even chanting in the streets or using phrases that make some people uncomfortable suddenly becomes an act of violence, right? But I will say this, I will preface this with sometimes historical movements that were to some extent violent, not always, have been sanitized as non-violent movements, right? MLK's is one, like civil rights movement. Yes, for the most part, non-violent, but it was violent. It had violent instances. And same with Pakistan and India's partition. I cringe every time people bring up Gandhi and talk about the non-violence movement. It wasn't non-violent. 2 million people died. And Gandhi wasn't as non-violent of a human as we make him to be because he was running a movement. And it's okay not to sanitize those movements and accept them in their raw form so that we can learn something from them.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast Gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast Gems.
Coming back to your book, once these new norms and structures emerge, how do you keep them from eroding or being rolled back? Especially when, say, initial coalitions fracture. How do we keep those coalitions intact as well?
And I could just say one thing real quickly. maybe this is too ambitious of me, but to try to connect our conversation that we've just been having about resistance tactics and violence and so on to the question you're asking now, which is that I fully recognize that the reality in history is never as clean as the stories we tell. Um, but if what we're thinking about now is how to strategize in a forward-looking way, I think for the reasons I was arguing before, I think the evidence is behind embracing nonviolent civil resistance. And I think also, more broadly in believing in politics, right? Believing that we can figure out how to live together within the political domain, outside of which is where I think of like reverting to violence. Part of the reason, though, I think also for embracing all the sort of organizing tactics and the community building and norm changing ideals that we've been talking about here is that when you use those sorts of approaches rather than a kind of us versus them mentality or a punitive kind of view, you start to create the kind of political culture that is in fact sustainable. So one of the reasons why violent resistance often goes so badly is because even if people win in the immediate sense, they lose in the longer term sense because they don't build a coalition that's capable of winning people's respect and governing over the long term. The version of this that we focus on in the book is about the importance of implementation when it comes to social change. And there's all kinds of examples of winning in the short term, but losing in the long term because it's very easy to get fixated on like a big moment of triumph and then to kind of be like, okay, we won, time to go home, right? And in much more banal contexts that we've been talking about here, where we're not talking about revolutions, but we're talking about improving policy and law and so on, what often happens is if people successfully mobilize to create some new law, say they change the building code in their city in order to make it so that new homes have to be energy efficient, the law changes, all the activists and the ordinary people go home, and then the lobbyists show up. And they're the ones who come to the zoning board meetings and the community board meetings, and they sit through all the boring minutia of implementing the new plans. And a lot of the good of social change gets lost there. The political scientist Leah Stokes has this great phrase where she talks about hard-won victories being lost in the fog of enactment. And she shows how that's happened again and again with climate legislation in this country at the state level, where nonprofits and activists leave the scene after a big victory, and then industry basically moves in and takes over. And so part of the story, I think, is embodying the values that we have that bring us to victory so that they create a durable coalition. And then I think another part of the story is thinking of social change as not just starting, but as being sustained over time and something that we have to stick with for the long haul.
If we were writing the book now, then we would definitely have at least a whole chapter on like how to stop democratic backsliding. The book is definitely a product of being written in a different moment. But another thing that we talk about there, Suzanne Mettler has studied all the ways in which people are unaware of what their government is doing for them. So if we want to safeguard our institutions, we have to let people know that the institutions are good for them. In one of her studies, she asked people, if they had ever taken use of a government program, and many said they never had. And then she had a list of 19 programs, and the average person had used 4, right? So the most notorious example of this was in the debates about expanding healthcare with Obama, where someone got up at a meeting and said, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." So that person was not aware that Medicare was a government program. Part of the reason for that is because of a sort of grand compromise that Democrats were willing to make in their efforts to create a social safety net, which is understandable because it was a way that they could get things done, but has ultimately had really bad consequences. It's possible that that person was getting their Medicare through a private plan. The US does a great number of things to redistribute wealth and create opportunities for people. But people don't know that it's doing that. And one of the biggest reasons is that a lot of it is in the form of the tax code. And so all you're aware of is like how much you are paying in taxes, and you're not aware of all the money that you're saving because of features of the tax code. So one of our mandates is to surface the state, is to unsubmerge the state so that people are aware of what the government actually is doing for us. And so again, this brings us back to the conversations we have with each other, where we can talk about the government programs that we've benefited from and why they were valuable to us.
I love that. And you're absolutely right. The narrative around is so messed up. It's like distortion of what's actually happening. But in the end, if you were to describe the United States of America in the context of how systems and individuals exist in this space, and what do you hope to change, if anything?
Okay. I'm trying to think of a way to say it. I guess my first stab would be that I see the United States, like I see people in the whole world, as mostly trying to do what they think of as good. They may have all kinds of crazy ideas about what's good or how to get it, and they may be misinformed by bad news sources or having grown up in communities that teach them anything from false information to abhorrent moral beliefs, but that with whatever they're bringing to the table, they're trying to do what they think is right. Oftentimes, like in the American context in particular, that goes through this lens of like me, like, am I being a good enough person? And so I think at the heart of what we're trying to do in the book is to tweak that a little bit for our readership, so that when people ask, like, am I clearing the moral bar, or am I doing good? Like, it's not just I, but it's like, what kind of a community member am I? What kind of a person in the country am I? Am I the kind of citizen that I ought to be? And who else is around me? And so again, we sort of phrase the book as about the relationship between individuals and their cultures and institutions that they live with. Both are really important, and how we connect the two is the heart of it.
Building on what Michael says, I think if we're thinking about the U.S., and so as Michael was saying, both individuals and structures are important, and the key phrase there is both and. And so when we're thinking about the United States, we also have to resist the tendency to fall into either or thinking, and thinking United States is either an unjust state or a just state. And we have to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. The United States is both the state that cemented slavery in its constitution, but it's also the state that declared, we the people hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And, it would have been better if they said all people. But of course, even at that time, they didn't even actually treat all men as created equal. But they both cemented our legacy of injustice in all sorts of ways. But they also sowed the seeds for opportunities for progress. And they did create the beginnings of almost democratic institutions that would, of course, we had to fight a civil war to overcome slavery. But a lot of other reforms in American history have happened through the democratic process, which we can understand broadly to include not just voting, but also disruption, nonviolent action, direct action, and so on. So I think we have to understand the U.S. both as an unjust nation, but also as a nation containing within it opportunity to become better.
Guys, where can people find your book?
Anywhere books are sold. They can buy it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or they can get it at Goodreads. They can also go to MIT Press's website, or they can ask for it at their local bookstore. So even if it's not yet on the shelves there, they can always ask for an order. They could also request their library stock it.
Oh, wonderful. And we'll share a link in our show notes. So listeners, if you want to check it out and buy it, do buy it. It's a very interesting book. You'll find the link in our show notes. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Alex. This was so good. Thank you.
Thanks, Saadia. This was really wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, total pleasure. Thank you again.
These are the kind of conversations that I want to have more of on Immigrantly. This is why Immigrantly podcast was created, for that intellectual tease, those in-depth, curious, interesting conversations. I loved sitting down with Alex and Michael, virtually, of course. I wish I could sit down with them in a studio to have this conversation. And I hope if you listened to the entire episode, there was something that you took away from it, some gem that resonated with you. And yes, I do agree with Alex and Michael both. We need to hold all truths together. The good and the bad can coexist in a way where we see things, countries, states, individuals in their full humanity with nuance, whether it is inconvenient or not. If you like this conversation, do me a favor. Share it with one person you think will like this conversation or learn something from it. Also, don't forget to buy Alex and Michael's book. It's a great read. I am reading it still, and I can't wait for you to read it and share your thoughts with me. You can reach out to me at sadia@immigrantlypod.com. This episode was written and produced by me. The editorial review is done by Shay Yu. Our sound designer and editor is Lou Raskin. Theme music for Immigrantly is done by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Come back next week for another important conversation. Until then, take care and be kind to others.